Hi, welcome to The Effects of Altruism by Ashley Hansen. Introduction, and these are the areas that we are going to go over today. The introduction of research question, literature review, research methods, hypothesis, analysis of findings, discussion, conclusions, and references. Those who engage in altruistic behaviors may believe that the well-being of others to be equally, if not more important than their own well-being. Those who act in altruistic behaviors do so with no concern of personal reward, but may find pleasure in having provided compassion. Now, although showing and giving compassion is in it of itself a positive pro-social behavior, can engaging in too much altruism have negative effects for the actor? I chose to research the possible negative effects of altruism as I noticed within myself that my many daily acts of selfless compassion were taking a toll on my willingness to engage others if I felt it may require any level of personal sacrifice. This included taking people's phone calls, interacting with people when I was outside of work. I just wanted to come home, focus on my schoolwork, and not have to interact because I was afraid that it was going to take up too much more time. So this caused me to question, how does altruistic behavior affect the individual performing it? I found this question to be extremely important as this was a major area of information that was missing in the research data about pro-social behavior and altruism. The potential contribution to this population and field of study is the importance of knowing if altruistic behaviors negatively affect the actor as to find a healthy balance between self-compassion and selfless compassion. Furthermore, reducing the possibility of prosocial behavior avoidance and compassion fatigue on a micro and interpersonal level. So now we're going to get into the literature review. So the first one is Attachment, Security, Compassion, and Altruism. This study suggested that theoretically, people who have the benefits of secure social attachment should find it easier to perceive and respond to other people's suffering, compared with those who have insecure attachments. In a series of studies, they found that compassionate feelings, values, as well as responsive altruistic behaviors are promoted by both dispositional and experimentally induced attachment security. The study examined the effects of attachment security on altruistic behaviors outside the laboratory. In particular, they assessed engagement in various altruistic activities such as caring for the elderly or donating blood. They found that avoidant attachment was negatively associated with engagement in such activities. Study 1, ECR, which means Experience in Close Relationship Scale, was used to measure the likelihood of a participant's compassion based on priming participants' ability to build attachment security. Participants then read several stories and rated how much they experienced compassion-related feelings and feelings of personal distress. As predicted, participants primed with an attachment security reported higher levels of compassion and lower levels of distress. This study ultimately showed that an individual is more likely to positively engage in altruistic compassion with lower levels of distress or fatigue when the actor has a secure attachment, whereas the actors who engaged in altruistic behaviors with non-secure attachment felt higher levels of distress. The double-edged sword of human empathy. This study is an integrative neurobehavioral model for compassion stress injury. It explains the double-edged sword of empathy and inherent vulnerability of helping professionals and caregivers. And so before I move on, I just want to highlight that in this article, it actually shared a story of a general who was in the military, but he was a psychiatrist. So it talked about he would see over like hundreds of people a day who were war vets who were actively engaged in combat. And so it goes on to describe how one night his wife had to call an ambulance because he was not moving, he was not talking, he was breathing, but he was like in a flat effect state where he just was not responding. And so it ended up being that he had acquired compassion stress injury. So his um, his being exposed to multiple people's traumas every single day, hundreds of times a day, eventually caused him a personal injury from compassion stress. So, furthermore, the article highlights the largely yet invisible scientific findings that have emerged over the past decade of identifying the neuropsychological mechanisms that enable human beings to understand and feel what another is feeling. Evidence has revealed that the phenomenon of human beings witnessing the pain and suffering of others is clearly associated with the activation of neural structures used during firsthand experience. The study further explored that a human empathetic capacity and altruistic behavior is regulated by the neural pathways that are responsible for the consciously controlled actions over the observer. The author hypothesizes that there is a dosage effect of severe stress, which is overwhelming, and that in CSI, compassion stress injury, there is a strong negative association between the combined cumulative effect of unregulated empathetic and sympathetic stress responses from primary and secondary compassion stressors, and its impact of protective, resilient self-care factors. Now, in this, I was able to identify something because I work in the mental health field myself. And so, all throughout the day, not only am I taking in and supporting others who are going through very devastating events in their life, but also guiding them through their recovery and coping skills and helping them process the things that they've not only gone through but are currently going through. I also find myself doing this process with my coworkers as we debrief with each other about our interactions with our consumers. So by the time I get home, I'm kind of mentally checked out and I just want to focus on my schoolwork and do the things that I know I need to get done, but I'm not finding the time for self-care. So, we'll continue that when a person has constant stress caused by an overload to the empathetic system, the actor cannot utilize their adaptive resources, and this leads to emotional contagion and erosion of self-care, which I was totally able to identify with. Okay, our third article is combating the thought that helping is hopeless. This article focused on the experiences of public audiences' compassion and compassion fatigue as it relates to exposure of news stories. This one I found extremely interesting too, because even when we're not engaged actively in an altruistic act or a selfless act, we are being exposed to many, many negative and heart-wrenching things through our televisions, our radios, social media, everywhere. And so this made me think, like, how is this also playing a role in why we might feel compassion fatigued even after just maybe a few acts of compassion where we're selflessly giving back to somebody else. You know, I've heard it said that what we bring in is what we project. So in this study, which results in audiences incurring a type of desensitization due to burnout. As a result, audiences lose compassion or the will to take action as it seems there is nothing they can do. This research implies that at one point people are compassionate but go through some type of process whereby they lose their compassion and become fatigued. Other causes have been discussed by the researchers, such as actors' exposure to too many social crises occurring in one year, right? We see nation and global trauma every single day on the news. Okay, so distance or relevance of the issues, unsolvable humanitarian issues, or personal traits and values of audience members. I found this article to be very important, although not directly related to qualitative research, as previous research has shown that prolonged exposure to stressful events does negatively affect a person's level of compassion and induces compassion fatigue. So this is why I thought that this article was important to my research. So differential pattern of functional brain plasticity after compassion and empathy training. So this one was important as well because this one is showing the actual imaging done to the brain when before and after a person has been trained and educated in empathy and compassion, and then they actually took MRI imaging of the brain and its activity as a person was being subjected to negative video images. So in this study, researchers sought to investigate whether empathy resonance and compassion training could reduce the negative emotions one acquires through the excessive sharing of others' negative emotions, and to investigate functional neuroplasticity underlying the augmentation of empathy, and to test the counteracting potential of compassion. The participants, who were all female, mind you, and first trained in empathy and subsequently in compassion, researchers repeatedly acquired functional resonance imaging measures as participants were exposed to video depicting other suffering. The results showed that participants in imaging reported empathy and negative affect significantly increased after empathy training. Positive affect increased after compassion training. However, it was unresolved on whether the neural systems serving empathy and compassion could be disassociated. For many research, this study is beneficial as it provides physical MRI evidence of the presence of stress when exposed to other suffering, and that stress was only reduced after having received actual training in empathy and compassion. And for most of the general public, they will never get training in empathy and compassion. So that's why I found this one to be very beneficial for my research as well. Attachment, caregiving, and altruism. Boosting attachment security increases compassion and helping. This study was a follow-up to the previous study of attachment, security, compassion, and altruism. That was the first study that I described during my literature review. Dispositional attachment security is associated with volunteering to help others in everyday life and to unselfish motives for volunteering. This article reports 5 experiments replicated in 2 countries, Israel and the United States, testing their hypothesis that increased security fosters compassion and altruistic behavior. Dispositional attachment-related anxiety and avoidance adversely influence compassion, personal distress, and altruistic behavior in theoretically predictable ways. Although this research was good for answering questions proposed by the previous study, it did not highlight any negative associations between altruistic behaviors and the actor themselves. It did, however, confirm that those with strong attachment security are better equipped to handle and engage in compassionate acts of altruism. So here I found a cute little picture that shows attachment styles. So like this study was observing, the better the secure attachment, the better off that somebody is going to engage in acts of compassion and altruism. So in secure attachment, somebody feels comfortable. In ambivalent attachment, somebody may feel nervousness, anxiety, stress. In avoidant attachment, there's no interaction. So I think that when it comes to compassion fatigue, somebody might move from being from the secure attachment into the avoidant attachment style. And so now we're going to move into the research methods part of my paper. For this research, the use of a survey was used to measure possible compassion fatigue fellow CBU students felt after completing the Day of Compassion assignment. Here was a rare opportunity to obtain self-reported compassion fatigue as it related to prosocial behaviors and compassion. A survey is a procedure for collecting information by asking members of some population a set of questions and recording their responses. The survey technique is very useful for identifying the average or typical response to a question. The survey technique is very useful for identifying the average or typical response to a question. Oh, I apologize, I just repeated that. It is also useful for identifying how groups or respondents differ from one another. In this research, a questionnaire survey was utilized using SurveyMonkey, an online survey site. This allowed for the participants to read and answer questions at their own pace. A benefit of using this type of survey was it was cost effective, first and foremost, and costed nothing to create and distribute to fellow classmates. The questions were as precise as possible, and I avoided using language that would lead or persuade respondents. In doing this, I increased the reliability and validity of the responses. And using the survey method, I was able to obtain data that was a first-hand experience of the respondents and the Day of Compassion assignment. The survey sought to answer my question of how does altruistic behavior affect the individuals performing it. I hypothesized that those who identified as having engaged in more acts of compassion throughout the day were more likely to have felt a higher level of perceived compassion fatigue. My opinions were derived from my own experience with the assignment, as I had felt a level of compassion fatigue myself. This feeling of fatigue, combined with my previous research of altruism, made me seek out to answer this phenomenon of compassion fatigue. There were several problems that were faced during this research. Examples are the number of respondents who participated in the survey. So although I emailed the link to the survey to all my classmates, I only received 9 responses. So the available time frames for the obtainment of survey results. So because I ended up changing my whole research focus and question, almost like the last week and a half before this assignment was due, I did face time constraints. So I changed the direction of research question, like I said, completing past research assignments to complete new research. So this included my literature review, my analysis of the literature and the data that the articles contained. I had to analyze the experiments and the data within those articles, and that was very time consuming as well. But it was worth it in the end because this was a research topic that I had actually found a lot of passion in finding out the answer. So, however, the use of the data analysis and literature review allowed for a more complete foundation on which to support research results. So here are the survey results. I'm not sure if I was correct on how I formatted this and how I put it. I haven't taken statistics yet. So I hope that this is good. So we are not going to read it, but we are going to go ahead and skip through because I also did charts that are much easier to read. So did the Day of Compassion interrupt your normal daily routine? So as we can see, 5 identified that there was no interruption at all. We have 2 identified that somewhat, and we have 1 that identified as absolutely. And so I want to highlight this because as we'll go through the continuing chart, we'll see that a lot of people identified as having compassion fatigue, and some on the higher scale said absolutely they felt compassion fatigue. But what I'm seeing here is that it was not due to stress of their acts of compassion interrupting their day. So I found that to be very important. So how many acts of compassion did you engage throughout the day? So we have, let me look at my research results. So in my results, which you can't see in the pie chart, but there was only 3 respondents who said that they had acted between 0 and 5 times. And then we had 6 respondents who said that they had engaged in 6 to 10 plus acts. So a majority of them engaged in 6 to 10 plus acts of compassion throughout that single day. Did you feel any sort of compassion fatigue by the end of that day? So we have 3 who identified as not feeling fatigued. We have 4 who identified as somewhat fatigued, and then we have 2 who identified as absolutely fatigued. Have you ever experienced compassion fatigue? So we have 4 who said yes, 4 who said no, and we have 1 who said, I don't know. Did you think a person could suffer negative consequences for having too much compassion? So we have 2 who said absolutely, 2 who said maybe, 1 who identified no, and 4 who identified as yes. And so here's an analysis of my findings. Throughout the process of analyzing individual responses, not all the responses as a whole, and breaking it down into data, but I also did each person's responses. So, analyzing individual responses to the survey, I discovered that, in fact, those who had engaged in more acts of compassion, in fact, did feel compassion fatigue. Regardless of the amount of identified personal reward respondents gained from each act, it was also important to note that the 2 respondents who self-reported feeling absolutely fatigued also identified in engaging in 10 plus acts of compassion on this day. These results confirmed that although an actor may gain personal reward for their acts of compassion, it does come with negative effects for the individual performing it. So, real quick, because I just realized that I did not actually create a chart for how many times did you feel you gained a sense of personal reward from offering others compassion. So, 2 people identified as gaining 3 rewards, personal rewards. 1 identified as receiving 5 personal rewards from their acts of compassion. 1 respondent identified as gaining 6. 1 respondent identified as having 7. And 2 had actually claimed that they had received 9 personal gains from their acts of compassion. And 2 more respondents identified as having 10 plus personal rewards. So this is pretty important information, considering that people identified as feeling fatigued and absolutely fatigued, and only 1 person said that they did not feel any sense of compassion fatigue on that day. So even though that they had gained pretty significant amounts of personal reward from their acts of compassion, they still felt fatigue. So in discussion and conclusion, survey results combined with previous research obtained from literature review show high probability that actors who engage in frequent pro-social behaviors such as altruism do in fact feel compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is an emotional and physical burden created by the trauma of helping others in distress. Secure social attachment theory claims that those who have a strong social attachment are more prone to engage in altruistic pro-social behaviors. The survey was unable to confirm this theory, meaning the survey I conducted was not able to link back to the attachment theory that I found in my literature review. The survey, this study of integrative neurobehavioral model for compassion stress injury proved that when a person has constant stress caused by an overload to the empathetic system, the actor cannot utilize their adaptive resources, and this leads to emotional contagion and erosion of self-care. This can be confirmed in the survey completed by CBU classmates, as respondents who engaged in more acts had an increase in compassion fatigue, which could have been caused by the inability to find time throughout the day to utilize self-care to recover. This research did raise questions for future research. Although altruistic behavior and compassion fatigue are highly researched, the primary sources and grounds of the research are with regard to healthcare, social work, and high stress and response institutional work. Academic research on the micro or individual impact of everyday altruism is sparse, which my survey sought to find out individual response from my classmates. It is in my own opinion that the results from the survey justify further research of a larger sample and how increased acts of compassion affect the average person, who is in micro makes up the macro of our society, and how these levels of compassion fatigue affect daily societal interactions. So my idea behind this is, in my own feelings of compassion fatigue and in my own isolation to not engage others who I feel I might have to enact in a selfless act with, I mean, if we consider everybody within our groups, our homes, our institutions who are feeling this level of fatigue and might not even realize that it's compassion fatigue, and how is that going to affect us all on a larger scale? And then this is the concluding of my paper, and here are the references. I was not able to format them correctly. I could not get them to hang. So unfortunately, I know I will probably be docked points for that, but I really enjoyed this class. I want to thank you for your support throughout this process, and I look forward to all my future classes at CBU, and I thank you and have a very, very blessed week.